Thank you all for coming. There we go. Okay. My name is Dorothy Warner. I'm with the LDA, the Lutheran Deaconess Association, and this is our Chicagoland Servant Stories event. So thank you all for coming. It's our first time doing something like this, and we're really delighted to have you. The LDA has been training people for servant ministry for over 95 years, and for much of that time, and for much of the expense of that time, has been covered by donations from individuals. And this event is a fundraiser for our scholarship fund, so thank you for paying your admission. And also, Karl and Gail Lutze have graciously donated his latest book to us, and all the purchases of those books also go to support our scholarship fund. So we appreciate your buying those books as well. And Karl is here. He is available to sign books after the event if he has not done so for you already. And we're just very happy to have that. A couple of program changes. We will not have an MC for this event. We're simply going to have each person or each performer come up when their time comes up in the program. So a couple of changes to the program. We are going to move Ben Emma's video towards the end of the program, so that we only have to move the screen out onto the stage once. We thought that might be a little bit better. And for the last reading from Karl's book, it will be read in tandem or in sequence or whatever between Peter and Tom Lutze. They both wanted to have a chance to read part of that reading. So that's one schedule change. We did plan the program to be an hour or a little maybe over an hour to give you a chance to mingle again after the program is over, before our time up is here today. So please feel free to do that. We're also going to be very informal, so if you still want to eat more of this wonderful food, please just get up whenever you feel a desire to get more food and help yourself to that. And I would like to thank Dave Samber and his staff for hosting us this afternoon.
What a delight to have you back. And I say back because you've been here several times. You actually are customers in my restaurant, for crying out loud. So welcome back, Karl, Gail, your family. What a joy. We go back almost 45 years that I go back to with the Lutzes. And I was just a little kid. You weren't much more than that, Karl, so thanks so much for being with us and for bringing all that you bring to our lives through your writings, but just for being with us. That was a great... long time ago, I started the Valpo Chicago Club right after I got out, so that's 40-some years ago. And I had an in with OP in those days, if you might remember. So we said, who could we bring? Who could be our featured person? This was out in the suburbs of Chicago. I said, well, I could bring O.P. Kretzmann. Are you kidding me? No, quick phone call, I'll take care of it. Well, the big deal was whether or not we were going to have wine or not served, okay? And I said, if O.P. Kretzmann's coming, there's going to be wine. So, Karl, when you come, there's soda bread. Today we baked extra soda bread so we could share. We've had it for the Feast of St. Patrick, which has now become a season. It's no longer just a day of drinking now, right? So, but we baked this today. I hope you enjoyed it. It's on the buffet. We made extra loaves that we're selling for $7.50 or two for $10, and all the money will go to the scholarship fund today. So, what did we sing in church today? Something about when the grain, what is it? How does it go? Like the seed falls down and must die to be in order to, well, we put together our wheat and made it into loaves of bread for your organization, so I'm glad to do it. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. There was no charge for parking, so you can stay for lots of time. You have no trouble at all. And come back. Come back.
mourn our dead, as you, Lord, in deep compassion, healed the sick and freed the soul. By your Spirit, send your power to our world to make it whole. As we worship, grant us vision till your love's revealing light, in its height and depth and greatness, dawns upon our quickened sight, making known the needs and burdens your compassion bids us bear, stirring us to ardent service, your abundant life to share.
On another occasion, this time at near midnight, a phone call from Mrs. Madden awakened me, pleading with me to join her at once at Moulton Hospital, where another relative, her niece, lay dying. I hurried to the waiting room where Mrs. Madden was seated and weeping, eager to explain to me what had been happening. The young woman had been dating a boyfriend for well over a year. She had found him mean and abusive and informed him of her decision to discontinue the relationship. On that very night, she accepted a date with a different young man. After their evening together, this new suitor had driven her to her home, and she approached the door to unlock it. Her jealous former boyfriend stepped from behind a shrub and splashed a bucket of gasoline on her and set her afire. Now at the hospital, as we looked at the young woman and saw her covered, literally from head to foot, with a charred crust, the attending emergency physician told us he'd never before seen such an intensive and extensive burn. He made it altogether clear that she would not and could not survive even till morning. And the doctor left the room. The patient was heavily sedated, but nonetheless cogent. Mrs. Madden introduced me to her, and she immediately responded by telling me she belonged to no church, had never been baptized, and that she wanted so very much to be baptized before taking her last breath. I spoke as helpfully as possible about our Lord, our faith, and the holy covenant of baptism, and the grace of our welcoming Lord extends to the people of God. And then I asked for a bowl of water with a towel and stepped close to the patient's bed. The sight was sobering. No courses at the seminary ever anticipated this situation. No part of this person's scorched body, hands, legs, face, ears, had been spared by the flames. Where does the water touch the would-be disciple? Well, of course, the bottom of the feet, where the fire had not reached. And the words of our Savior sound clearly, "If I have washed your feet, ought you not wash one another's feet?" A reading from Karl's book. That foot washing ministry of Karl's is the heart of the ministry of deacons and deaconesses, and so I too want to welcome you. The diaconate indeed grows out of Jesus' command to wash one another's feet, to serve wherever there are needs in our world that needs God's love so very much. Karl and the LDA have served together for many, many years. Karl first began serving on our board of directors, as far as I can find, in the year 1965. Karl's first wife, Esther, also served 2 terms on our board of directors. Together, they were integral parts of teaching Deaconess students about social justice. In the 80s, I took as many classes from Karl as I could and sat often at Esther's feet and around their table, soaking up their wisdom and experiences. Shortly before Esther's death, the LDA officially made her a Lutheran deaconess, although we all know that she was one her whole life. Karl and Gail have continued that commitment to the LDA, serving on numerous committees, phoning countless donors to raise money for the LDA, and even baking hundreds of cupcakes and cookies. And this beautiful book, Into a Wider World, filled with powerful stories like the one I just read, is just the latest way that they are helping us. Dorothy said that the proceeds will be going to our scholarship fund, and we've just been finishing our budget for the next year, and we're looking for $60,000 to provide all the students with needs for scholarships so that they can answer God's call to serve God's people, following in the footsteps of servants like Karl. And so your presence here and your purchasing of Into a Wider World will make the difference to all of these young men and women. And I hope you enjoy the afternoon.
I met Don Larson during our days as students at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. We sang together in 3 different choirs during our time there. More than a dozen years later, we had many more occasions to see and work with each other. During the in-between years, while I served parishes in Black communities in Oklahoma, Don was pastor in racially changing communities in Detroit. He now was a staff person for the National Lutheran Council, which later became the Lutheran Council USA, an inter-Lutheran agency that served to coordinate ministries of the major Lutheran church bodies. Meanwhile, I had begun my work with the Lutheran Human Relations Association of America. Don attended LHRAA meetings, but these occasions hardly provided us with much time for relaxed visiting and conversation before going our separate ways. We were in New York on August 16, 1965, a very warm day. As our meeting ended, Don and I compared our return to Chicago flight schedules. To our surprise, we had both been booked to fly out of LaGuardia for Chicago on United Airlines Flight 389. We checked with United Reservations and were able to reserve seats on a later flight, allowing us time for dinner together and a longer visit as well. Once we had boarded and settled in our seats, we commented on how gratifying it was that we had been able to work out that change of plans. It was not until the next morning that we learned the fate of the flight we had canceled. When nearing Chicago, it had plunged into Lake Michigan and all 30 aboard had been killed. I don't remember any subsequent visit when Don and I would be together again that we didn't recall the astonishing climax of that day. In the months that followed, I kept on flying. My tightly packed calendar scheduled me to attend meetings and appointments in every geographic direction. By this time, we had more than 50 chapters of LHRAA. My responsibilities at the university had also increased. I would often find myself on the road 3 or more days of a week. A phone call from my good friend Elmer Witt, who is now executive director of the Waltha League, asked me to take on an additional assignment. He knew full well how demanding my schedule had been, but he was hoping that he was asking would provide a change of pace, a chance to catch my breath. He asked me to spend a week at a camp with youth near Red Lodge, Montana. Two adult counselors would be on hand to assist me in a 5-day stay, leading some 30 people of high school age in a program of Bible study, recreation, singing, creative writing, and worship. I agreed to help out. Good program, good setting, good staff, good kids, altogether a good week. Well, pretty good. One young fellow just didn't seem to fit. I don't recall his name. I'll call him Larry. When it came time to choose a lead player for various contests and games, he would always step forward to the head of the line. When groups of campers with similar interests would be sitting together at mealtime, Larry would invariably choose a place in the middle of one. When questions were posed for discussion time, he'd be first to raise his hand or to answer before being called on. Staff members found him pushy and overbearing. We agreed his presence was often obtrusive. The campers themselves were more obvious in their resentment of his self-assertiveness. For the Thursday evening session, by way of assessing the week's experience, the campers had been given the assignment to write an essay telling about themselves and what the highlight of their stay had been. They were to read their pieces to the group. I called on them in alphabetical order, and as it happened, Larry's turn came last. He stood. With a softer voice than he normally had used, he started reading. He told us his dad was a farmer, and they lived on a large ranch. There were no people his age living within miles. Larry had no brothers or sisters. His dad was his very best friend. His dad was very much involved in some national agricultural organization. Larry's mother and he would drive him to the airport and call for him again upon his return. As Larry continued reading his essay, we learned how almost a year had passed since his dad had been away for such a meeting. As usual, Larry and his mom made the trip to the airport to meet him. When they arrived, they were told the flight would be late. They waited and waited. The plane's arrival was delayed even longer. They were told to return home, and they would be called and informed as to when the arrival time would be announced. After long hours of waiting, there still had been no call. The next morning, the sheriff's car came up their long driveway. He told them the bitter news that Larry's dad's plane, on that leg of its trip between New York and Chicago, had plunged into Lake Michigan. Larry's father and all others aboard had died. Then Larry read the last paragraph of his essay, in which he told of the loneliness that was his since his dad, who had been his very best friend, had died. And he added a word of gratitude to God for all the kindness and caring he had been experiencing with these new friends he had been with this week. Everything was quiet as we gathered for our customary evening round of cookies and hot chocolate. But this time it was different. It seemed everyone wanted to sit near Larry, surely a bit ashamed, but grateful for the love he'd shown us. And I remembered my colleague in ministry, Don Larson. For Larry's father had died on Flight 389, the one we had not taken.
When I was a teenager, I was a pretty clean-cut kid. I grew up on the south side of St. Louis near Tower Grove Park. One day I was walking down the street and I saw a little old lady coming toward me, so I smiled at her. As we passed on the sidewalk, she clutched her purse close to her and gave me a fearful look, walking wide around me. I felt hurt and confused and offended. As a teenager, I often felt misjudged and misunderstood. I remember thinking to myself that day that I wanted to remember that feeling so that when I was an adult, I wouldn't treat teenagers that way, that I wouldn't fear them just because of their age, Even then, I felt a calling to work with youth, and my pastor saw these gifts in me and encouraged me to become a deaconess. I've been involved with youth now for over 20 years, and I've learned several things. One is that ministry goes both ways. It's not just about me ministering to youth, but how they also minister to me. I was on a mission trip with our youth group in West Virginia several years ago. My father was dying in St. Louis, and it had been a week or two since I checked in with him. And one day at our work site, it just hit me really hard, and I started to cry. I was scared, and the kids surrounded me right at that moment. They wrapped me in a big group hug, and they prayed for me and my dad, and it was beautiful. The second thing I've learned is that a lot of ministry happens in the car. When I pick up kids for confirmation class or when we travel to faraway places for mission trips, they talk. They talk about what's going on at school, at home, with boyfriends and girlfriends. They share real pieces of their lives with me, and they let me share myself with them. And it's a beautiful thing. The third thing I've learned is that even when things don't go as planned, God is there. On our mission trip last year, I was having a hard time. One night toward the end of the week, we had a worship service that would involve prayer stations, where all the adults would stand in a circle around the room and the youth could come to them and ask for prayer. As I stood there, I asked God to be with us, all of the adults, to give us wisdom to deal with whatever would come up, to give us mercy and love, and to know the right words to say. As I stood there, the first youth came up and we prayed together. And when I looked up from praying with that child, I was just blown away, because there in front of me was a line of children from my church waiting their turn very patiently. I could feel the Holy Spirit moving in me, giving me the words to say to each child as they bared their hearts to me. It was one of the most powerful and poignant times in my life, and it was beautiful. God uses us just as we are. The Holy Spirit fills us up to do what lies ahead. Sometimes we feel it, but other times we step out in faith, trusting God, trusting our training, and knowing that we are not alone. I am so thankful to be a part of this diaconal community that supports me, stretches me, and encourages me to keep growing. It is beautiful.
Good afternoon. I'm Deaconess Nancy Walter. I am what you might call a second career deaconess. I started my studies while I was still employed for 30 years in the federal courts, and then I completed my program after retiring and was consecrated a little over 2 years ago. One thing sticks in my head, a story, and it involves being ministered to and ministering to, just as Barb talked about. There's a course that we take called CEM, which is a chaplaincy course. And the night before I was to start that course, I was laying on a couch in my brother's hospital room at Community Hospital. Not long after I retired, he had been diagnosed with lymphoma, which had gone to his brain lining, unfortunately. And he was in such a state that he needed one of us with him all day, and particularly at night, when the terrors would be their worst. He woke up in the middle of the night, just wild-eyed, and said to me, "Nance, you have got to get me out of this jail." And I literally had to almost lay on him to keep him from leaping from the bed and disconnecting himself from his port and his other IVs. And after a beautiful nurse and I had calmed him down and he was asleep again, I laid on the couch and tears just filled my eyes, and I said, "God, I don't know how I can do this chaplaincy class. I just don't know." Well, the chaplaincy class started, and I found that even though I ministered during that class, visiting all the folks in the hospital and doing the class work together, how much the class ministered to me. They were with me. They wanted to know how I was doing. They asked for constant updates on Tom. And then spring break came, and unfortunately, after his very short and ferocious battle, Tom died over spring break. And when I came back, they were just as supportive, but they also respected me in that I was one of the community, and they were there for me as I needed, but I was still one of the classmates performing all the requirements of the class. And that was a wonderful anchor for me. It helped me in the early days of my grief. And so that's what the community has meant to me. They reflect back to me love and service. And they bring me joy. They call me into accountability. And we all serve together in whatever it is we're doing. And in serving, we are served, and in being a blessing, we are blessed. Thank you.
My name is Deaconess Claire Shep. I serve in 2 parishes here in Chicago. One I do youth and family work, and the other I do administrative work. And it is such a joy to have all of you here in my city. It's really mine. I own it. But I just wanted to share with you a couple stories from Luther, where I do youth and family work. One of my greatest joys there is working with the youth choir that I got to start. I find that in our lives, when we are given opportunities to be in the arts or do that thing that we are just most passionate about, we discover our own spirituality, and that's more true for children, I think, than we normally realize. So part of my work in this youth choir is to give them an opportunity to say prayer requests every week. And normally when people ask me, how's it going, I don't tell them this part of the story. But this is my favorite part of the whole week. For 15 minutes, they raise their hands. These little kindergartners through 5th graders are raising their hands, just wanting to say something about their week, wanting to tell me, each other, wanting to be heard. And as the seasons change and as their lives change, you hear more and more. Sometimes they tell very deep secrets. Sometimes they share very lighthearted things. They love Wednesday, it's hump day, every week. But they tell things of heartache, about how they know they're going to be moving, and don't tell my friend because I haven't figured out how to tell them yet. Or they will talk about how their dad is having back problems and how that's hard because their parents are in the middle of a divorce. And that's especially difficult on their mom who's supporting their dad, but you get the story in that moment. I try to keep them to about 3 or 2, so we only have 15 minutes for prayer requests, but they beg for more and more. And I've also found that it's interesting as the seasons go, as this space is opened up for them to discover their own spirituality, this special time. They find room for the joys too, especially as soon as the weather changed. I've noticed there's this new energy in the room, where there was a little bit more gloominess until about last week, and then we had that surge of 70-degree weather. Now there is this lighthearted joy. They are so thankful every single time they're all together in the same room. This is a prayer request. Everybody's here. We're so happy. Not me, them. I am happy they're there. And that just ministers to me in a way that nothing else really can. When you find that they have made space for you to grow. Those little ones do that all the time. And so it's my privilege to work with them. And I thank you all for making that possible, for for helping me discover my own spirituality, for making room for me through the arts, through servanthood, so that I can make room for others. Second story, and the only other story. There's this fun thing when you work with volunteers, is you get the joy of trying to figure out how do you pull out the best from them. And there's this one Sunday school teacher that I have. I work with the Sunday school, and so younger kids all the way through older kids and adults. And I have this one Sunday school teacher who, when I first started working there, was a yeller. She was. And she knows this about herself, and she doesn't want to be a yeller. But the way that Sunday school had been formed and had been shaped, and the space, it wasn't giving her room to explore her gifts and help others find room to explore their gifts. And so we shifted some things, we played with time, and then it hit me, just let her use her gifts. So now in our Sunday school, instead of making sure that we get through all of these things and we check off this list, we tell stories, we reflect, we sing, and if the work isn't done this week, we'll work on it next week. And the kids have responded, and she's not yelling. She's singing, she's leading me, she's leading other teachers. And I have learned how to tell stories better from her. I've learned how to hear stories better from her. And it's been such a joy. So thank you for that. Thank you all.
My name is Jack Walter. I am a Deacon student. Obviously, I am a non-traditional Deacon student. And before I tell my story, I'd like to offer a thank you first. There was a time when the Deacon community was so small that it could be accommodated in Karl and Gail's basement for seminar. Diane said, "Will you go home to Cherville, or will you stay with the community?" And I said, "It's important to be part of the community." Well, what I didn't know was the hospitality that the Lutzes were giving me was one of the benefits of being in community. Not only did they provide us with a place for sanctuary, great food, but when you get accepted by Karl and Gail Lutze to live in their basement, the resistance to having males in the community kind of evaporates a little bit. So for Karl's acceptance of men in the community and for hospitality, I'm going to take this opportunity to say thank you. I am a Matthew 25:39 man. I visit the prisoner. I am involved with Kairos Prison Ministry International. And our motto is, listen, listen, love, love. I have been trained by the Indiana Department of Corrections to be the perfect volunteer. And one of the cautions is, never show surprise. You cannot let people know what they are saying affects you in any way. I was in Indiana State Prison for my third weekend as a volunteer there. It's the maximum security facility for the Department of Corrections. What I wasn't prepared to see was a 23-year-old man who had done 5.5 years at Michigan City at Indiana State Prison already. The context meant he was going to serve life. The facial tattoos told me that he had taken life. He sat next to me for 3 days on my right hand On my left hand, there was a middle-aged man who was a kingpin in logistics for a drug ring. Distribution on my right, supply on my left. I listened, and despite myself, I came to love both of them. Well, the beauty of this ministry is it goes back every month. We don't forget these men, we go back. The first 2 months, the logistic overlord was there, but there was no sign of the distribution guy, Luis. The third month, Lou walked in. I smiled and said, "Lou, it's good to see you." He looked at me and said, "You remembered my name." And in that moment, it had flashed across my brain. Lou's parents had forgotten that he existed. There were no letters, there were no visits, and every time that Lou tried to ask for forgiveness, the letters were mailed but came back unopened. There was no way for Lou to get forgiveness. What my mother had taught me as a rule of just good manners suddenly became something. It became a moment of ministry. And in that moment, I saw Lou as Jesus. But this time, Peter didn't mock him by forgetting who he was. Peter remembered him, called him by name, shook his hand, and embraced him. And I'm sure I violated an Indiana Department of Corrections rule. I'm sure my face showed every bit of it. Your generosity, Karl, and your generosity, folks, makes this possible. Without a scholarship, I wouldn't be able to do this, and I wouldn't be able to become a deacon. Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to tell you this story.
Jack's a hard act to follow. I am Deaconess Incognito Jane Schreiner. I have never served in an official capacity as a deaconess, a paid position or something with the title attached. Mostly I've been a mother, a volunteer, and in the last 25 or so years, a business owner. My latest business was a resale shop. And occasionally someone would come in with something they wished to sell me rather than purchase. Sometimes that was a really good thing and sometimes not. Well, one afternoon I was in the shop. I believe it was a weekend, like a Saturday late, and a young woman walked in and she had a few items in her possession in a bag and all wrapped up nicely. And she said she had children in the car, she needed gas money to get home and some money to give them food. And the things she had with her were from her grandmother, but she had decided to sell them because she needed the money. Well, that could have been a tall tale. I'd never met this woman before, but I said, okay, well, let's see what you have. And she had probably 4 or 5 items. They were nice, they were not chipped or damaged, but they were not things I would have gone and purchased for the shop, just left to my own wishes. She really seemed sincere and in need, so I excused myself for a moment and asked her, I said, I just need a little time to think about this. So I went into the other room for a minute and I thought to myself, well, I really don't need these things, but she seems desperate. So I went back and offered her $25, which was more than I really wanted to pay for them. And again, I didn't really want these things in the first place. She was crestfallen. And she obviously was hoping to get full value of these things as if they were being purchased new. So I took a deep breath and again excused myself for a moment and said, let me think about this a minute. And I felt this huge pull at my heart, my deaconess heart, my servant heart. It's not about the stuff, it's not about the money, Jane. You can afford to give this woman more than that. So I went back and offered her double and said, please take your grandmother's things. I don't want to take your grandmother's things. Well, excuse me, I'm also Deaconess Weepy Jane Schreiner, as many of you know. She was absolutely stunned. Couldn't believe it, wasn't sure she should take it, but I assured her that I was led to offer that to her, and that it was not a problem, and that I hoped that we could keep in touch. And we have kept in touch, not often, but every once in a while we'll give each other a call. She was also looking for work and hadn't been able to find it in her field. She and her husband were having difficulty in the marriage, partly because of finances. And here they had these precious young children to care for. About 3 weeks later, in the door comes Lauren. And this time she had stuff again. And I first thought, oh no, now what? And she had brought in some things that she said she and her children had gone around their house looking for, that they could give me in lieu of the grandmother stuff that she had wanted to sell to me in the first place. Some of them were not perfect. Some of them were things I actually sold. But I saved this one as a reminder of Lauren. Yesterday I gave her a call because I wanted to tell her that I'd saved this piece. And I wanted to tell her that I was going to tell her story today, or the story that transpired as of her coming to visit me at the shop. I just want to sum it up by saying it was great to talk to her again. We intend to get together now. She's having a hard time once again, so I'll have another opportunity to maybe be of help to Lauren. But I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but to say this is something we can all do. Whether you have the title Deaconess Incognito or simply Deaconess or Deacon, or whether you are whatever your name is with no title attached, we can all share our servant heart at any time, in any place when we're called on to. And I hope you all will. Thank you.
It is always such a joy to get a glimpse at the ways that people are out serving, the ways that women and men are answering the call. The challenge is that time limits us. And we had 6 stories, am I counting right? 6 stories just gives you a sliver at the ways that the diaconate of the LDA is impacting not only the communities that they live in, but our world. We have deaconesses and deacons that serve here in Chicago, like Claire. We have them serving in Northwest Indiana, all over the United States, and in various places around the world. The hardest thing is explaining to people what a deaconess or a deacon does, because it's not always tied to a job title. And in fact, in my job as co-director of education and formation, the greatest job in the world, which Diane told me as I was transitioning, and now I get to tell others, the hardest thing can be explaining to those that feel a sense of call, but don't know where it fits, exactly what it would mean at the end of the program. Because our program isn't just about getting a degree. It's not about just going to seminary and getting the classes done and coming out with the head knowledge you need to serve. That's a component. We require some academic courses to be taken. Some of our students take those at Valparaiso University. We have students at LSTC here in Chicago and at seminaries and colleges and online learning programs throughout the world. But there's more to that in becoming a deaconess or a deacon. There's more to being formed as the students are in process, and if we're honest, as we continue to be formed even after we get the big pin. We have components around spirituality and learning how it is that we interact with God. Where do we make sure our souls are being fed? How do we help in leadership of serving those around us and walking with them? We invite our deaconess and deacon students to do a variety of service experiences. Like Nancy shared, they have a chaplaincy experience that's required. Some serve at homeless shelters, some are in churches, others venture off to the prison. All exploring those various places where we are called to serve as that bridge between church and world. And then we have that other piece that sometimes is what draws people in to kind of finally say, I'm willing to answer that call. And that's community. For those times when I struggle to keep serving, those times where I start to beat myself up, it's usually my community that says that they know God is still working in me. God is still using me. It's my community that holds me accountable when I like to get comfortable in my own life, and my eyes and my ears and my heart is challenged by my sisters and brothers to pay attention to the world around me, to listen to those places that God is calling us to go into, to go to those places and sit with those that sometimes our society wants to forget. And somehow, as people walk as a student through these various components, they come out changed. They come out ready to say yes, to live a life of faith and action, and say yes to continuing to being formed, realizing the journey's not done yet. And I get to glimpse that transformation as it happens. It's pretty easy to go on Facebook or the internet, or even, let's be honest, sitting in the pews of our churches and hear stories about why our church is in despair. We need to be scared and sad and nervous, and yes, those emotions are true. But what I get to see is sometimes the radical doors that are being opened when we're forced to think about service in a new way. Ministry in new places. The world isn't going to stop changing. The church isn't going to stop having challenges. But what I truly believe with all my heart and soul and passion, and what keeps me motivated every day, is the diaconate is going to continue to be in that bridge that calls the church out and brings the world in, and helps us to be a little bit more creative about where we might be going and where God might be calling us to serve. So thank you for being at this event, and for those of you that have been friends of the LDA for a long time, I was a student that was blessed by your scholarship support. I wouldn't have been able to do it without. And I get to sit and hear the dreams and passions and transformation of the students that are being called to serve now. And even hearing the twinklings of those that are dreaming about answering the call. And it's much easier to have that conversation when we talk about how the LDA strives to make the formation program affordable for all people, despite their socioeconomic state and background. Because all people are called to serve. And so thank you for helping to make that possible.
The Albany March, August 28th, 1962. It was, excuse me, it was the busy, tension-packed midsummer of 1962. Dr. Martin Luther King was inviting like-minded church leaders in the North to stand with black citizens, supporting them in their efforts to register to vote. In the 12 preceding months, more than 1,000 black citizens of Albany, Georgia, had made their way to the voters' registration office, only to be denied and carried off to jail. To be released, each had to pay $200, a staggering investment in freedom made by a near impoverished community. In promoting this demonstration, Dr. King was hoping to gain the involvement of clergy persons of as many religious denominations as possible in an action that would capture the attention of reporters and television cameras from all across the country. This unusual event was intended to be a statement of concern for fellow citizens of the South who were being denied their basic human rights simply because they were African American. Back home, members of the respective church bodies would surely see how committed their leaders were in expressing their moral indignation at the tolerance for the persistent blight of segregation that had become the African American scourge and the nation's shame. Andrew and I immediately realized the responsibility that was ours to assure Lutheran support for the plan. When Valparaiso's President Kretzmann heard of our decision to be involved, he assured us of his support for our participation in the event. Members of King's staff were pleased with the promise of our participation and notified us of a briefing meeting to be held in the Chicago area the following Saturday. Our calendar for those weeks was already crowded with commitments. We agreed that one of us should go and the other would stay behind to mind the store. When Saturday arrived, we drove to Chicago for the preparation session. Andrew Young and another of Dr. King's team were on hand to make sure we understood the physical and mental dangers that lay ahead for participants. This preparation included demonstrations of how to cover one's head and in other ways protect oneself when physically attacked. They explained the principles of nonviolence and non-retaliation, and they would not be offended should any who volunteered to go along south choose to withdraw. Andrew Schulze was not in his strongest health at this time, and I offered to go south on the bus with the other clergy folk from the Chicago area. Andrew's response: "No, Karl. I've been writing and speaking on all this for years, and now that I'm faced with the challenge to stand up and be counted, I cannot walk away." A few days later, we were in Chicago again, this time to see Andrew and his friends board the bus to Albany. The mood of the participants, as well as that of their loved ones, was sober. All of us were quite familiar with reports of the brutal physical harm that others had experienced in demonstrations elsewhere. No banners had been pasted on the sides of the bus. Windows were closed. No singing of "We Shall Overcome" or any of the other freedom songs. The focus of these visitors was to spell out their commitment to stand at the side of these courageous people of Albany, who have been seeking for their neighbors, their children, and themselves the rights God would have them enjoy for a full life that was rightfully theirs as citizens of this country. Albany Chief of Police Lori Pritchett assumed a unique role in what, in many respects, brought a touch of pageantry to the event. As the busload of church folk arrived at the outskirts of Albany, they were stopped by two policemen who escorted the visitors to homes in the black community for the night. Next morning, the Northerners appeared on the sidewalk outside the county courthouse. As if the script for what was happening had been written beforehand, Chief Pritchett, neatly groomed for the occasion, addressed the group asking, "Why are you here?" There had been no spokesman appointed for this confrontation. A rabbi in the group spoke up, "We have come here to pray." Pritchett resumed lead man role, ordering these church folk to disband and return to their pulpits up north and tend to problems there. And when these church folk did not comply, they were arrested. These people had, in a quiet, orderly way and with dignity, presented themselves as faithful friends of people who had been victims of continued abuse and injustice. They were taken to jail. One of the women travelers stepped aside so she would not be arrested. She provided contact and communication with the sponsoring church groups in the north, apprising them of what was happening to their confined partners. The little county jail was hardly able to accommodate this sudden spillover of residents. Neighboring county jails helped out, and when all available beds were put to use, pallets were brought in for excess inmates' use.
It was in these hours that Valparaiso University's President Kretzmann sent a message to President Kennedy, urging him to bring the involvement of his office to support efforts to rid the country of systems of segregation that stain our image as a democratic nation. The incarcerated church leaders were reluctant to speak much of their days of imprisonment. Andrew put it this way: "Karl, what we are experiencing here is just a few hours, a few days. The people of Albany have had to live under this cloud of suppression and fear day after day for years. It is they who are the survivors, the heroes, rather than the few of us who tasted its ugliness for such a short time and then left again." Andrew spoke a bit about the filth of the jails, the roaches and other bugs, and the stench. He told too of the night that the two not-so-friendly jailers came into their cell with two very large and very drunk Negro men and told them, "Look at all these people lying here, half asleep. They're all white preachers, and they came here because they love colored people. So get them up and give them all a hug." Andrew explained that the two men were really frightened by the situation. The clergy got up and they walked over to meet the two inebriates and embraced them. This angered the two officers, who then left, taking the two arrestees with them. The jailed visitors from the north returned to their sleeping spots. Theirs had been a long day. They were hardly back to sleep, however, when the two jailers and their charges returned. This time, they ordered the men to urinate on the clergy. Of course, they were reluctant, but this was the South. Later, when he was back at his desk in our office, Andrew would often recall his Albany experience. He counted those days as some of the most important in his entire life. He recalled the celebrative thank you service that the black community held upon his release and their expressions of gratitude. And of course, there were letters of commendation and appreciation from fellow Lutherans for his demonstration of courage and faithfulness. There were also letters from a few Lutheran people who resented his poor judgment, his disappointing conduct, and his thoughtless action. Andrew had begun having health problems, but he said he was always aware that his Lord was with him, and his stay in Albany had been endurable because of that assurance. At one of our LHRAA board meetings, we were prepared to travel to St. Louis's Lambert Field, where we'd be catching our flights to our different home sites. It had been a good meeting, so we were hardly prepared for a hurried announcement by one of our local hosts, who had stood to thank us for coming. He then told how in this very hour the local radio stations had reported a march that was getting underway heading to the heart of the city, commemorating the death of a civil rights worker. One of our group rose to say, "There always seem to be people who regard marchers as troublemakers. In our Vanguard, the newspaper of LHRAA, we've always reminded our readers of the official statement of our government, assuring us that it shall be the right of people to peacefully assemble in the redress of grievance. This would be an opportunity to endorse and affirm such a stand." Not only did we all stay on for 4 more hours to join in the demonstration, but we found ourselves being photographed by the St. Louis Globe Democrat's Paul Okrasa, assigned to cover the event for his paper. Paul identified himself to us as Lutheran. He said he was so very surprised to find a group of Lutherans participating in this display of interracial concern. With that, he handed his camera to a coworker and joined the march.
And today is all about stories. And that has truly been the theme of my ministry and just sort of my life in the past 5 years. So in this video, this depicts a little bit about the journey I took through the LDA. This is just the formation process and sort of where I all started and where I became as a nurse. So since then, I have been serving as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, where I've been blessed to listen to many stories. Stories of men and women who have lived their lives in the mill and working their days and nights trying to raise a family, to people who are in bed and no one will listen to them because they no longer can talk, but you can listen through their nonverbals and through their eyes. To be able to hold their hands of people who don't speak English and be able to know that they are cared for and they're loved. So these are just a few of the moments as a nurse that most nurses are able to be blessed with. But through the LDA and through learning through wonderful mentors like Karl and Gail, I have been able to treasure these stories in my heart. So enjoy the video and remember that this is my path and these are my pictures. However, this is not just my story. This is the story of our community at the LDA.